so on my machine, I already have the local database installed. I have DynamoDB, I downloaded it, I extracted it. Okay, and on my machine, where that's going to reside is under my home directory under AWS. And you can see there's the DynamoDB _ local latest. That's what was extracted from my zipper tarball. Okay, so that's where I want to work from, is this AWS directory. So if I'm in a command line or terminal, whatever, like a command line being Windows, terminal being Unix, if that's the case, then I'm going to navigate to this directory in order to see those files. Okay, so that path is under, so it's on the hard drive, users, Brian Witkowski, AWS. So if I go out to a terminal on a Mac, so on my machine, when I open a command prompt, it automatically puts me in my home directory. So if I print the working directory, you can see it's users, Brian Witkowski. Everyone good with that? My home directory on any Unix environment, any terminal environment on Unix, is going to be referred to as that tilde. So my home directory being users, Brian Witkowski, is that tilde. That's how I represent that home directory. So I could put users, Brian Witkowski, that's fine. And I would get to that AWS directory. Okay. Alternatively, kind of a shortcut to that is I can just use tilde/, and that replaces the users, Brian Witkowski, and then I can go into AWS. And I can do a directory listing. So on my Unix terminal, I'm using ls as opposed to dir on Windows. And you can see that this is the local DynamoDB installation. Okay. So I've set up a command. So I created a shell script that runs this Java command. Otherwise, I can just copy and paste this Java command. Unable to access the jar file because I have to be in that DynamoDB latest. Okay, and my database is running. I also created a shell script so I can just execute this run DynamoDB sh on my machine. So once I have that, I'm going to open up another terminal tab. So I'm just hitting Command T. So I have another terminal command. And I want to be able to, I'm just going to change my working directory. What I want to do is I want to be able to list all of my tables. Okay, I want to verify that I have some tables there. Okay, so if I want to do that, I'm going to do AWS DynamoDB. The command is list tables. And then I have to specify my endpoint URL being my local machine. Okay, so I want the DynamoDB instance on my local machine. So the way I'm going to specify that is using localhost :8000. See how I have no tables? It's empty. Okay, I don't want it to be empty. I want to load in my baseball stats database table. Okay, so in order to do that, I'm going back over to course content. We talked about how to create that local table and how the command's a mess, right? So that's one of the commands that we have. So here we have AWS2 DynamoDB, and on Unix, it's just AWS, the command is. So I'm going to take that, I'm going to copy it, and bring it over to a text editor. So I'm just bringing it into Atom. And I don't want AWS2, I just want AWS. I want to create a table named baseball stats local. It's going to have a primary key, which is teamID, and a sort key, which is just SK. I have the key schema defined, I have the provision throughput defined, and I have the endpoint URL defined. Okay, so I have some parameters. I'm now just going to copy and paste this command over into my terminal. Okay, it basically tells me it's successful, and I can see that if I list the tables now. So see how I have the one table? Okay, now I'm ready to import my data, right? So this table exists. There's no data in the table. Okay, so I want to, I can verify that. So if I do AWS DynamoDB, I want to scan a particular table named baseball stats local, and I'm doing that on my specific endpoint URL. Okay, so you can see there's no data in the table. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to load that seed data. And again, that seed data is coming from Blackboard. So if I go back over to course content, there's the seed data for DynamoDB. It's really 3 different JSON files. I already have those files sitting on my desktop. So if I look on my desktop, here's the exercise files. Here's that 202 directory with 3 different files. If I open these 3 files, so I'm just going to open those 3 files with Atom, you'll see that the table name it uses is just baseball stats, and that's going to be a problem. We fixed this in the past. I want the local instance because I changed the database name for my local instance to distinguish, so I'm changing it again. And I want to import that data. In order to do that, what I want to do is I want to navigate out to this directory. That's the easiest way to do that. So I'm going to use the change directory command. So I'm just going to go cd, and then the way I want to get out there is I'm just going to drag and drop this folder path. And now if I do a directory listing, you can see those 3 files. So see how I changed the working directory? So cd to change my directory, and then I dragged the directory that I wanted to navigate to from the File Explorer out to my terminal. You can do the same thing on Windows, but you need to be using PowerShell instead of your command prompt. So if you don't want to type in that full path, and no one wants to type in that full path, you're certainly capable of doing that, but you have to do it through PowerShell. Okay, the same with the commands that I'm using. So when I do a directory listing, I'm just typing in ls. So when I type in ls, that's not going to work on Windows unless I'm using PowerShell. PowerShell is just kind of a more powerful command prompt. And when I say it's more powerful, it has Unix-like commands and Windows commands, so it'll kind of go back and forth and it'll interpret for you. Okay, so now that I'm in that directory, I want to load that seed data from those files. The way I'm going to do that is it's just 3 separate commands, so AWS DynamoDB, and I want the batch write item, and then the request items are going to be my file path. Okay, so the / indicating in my current directory, so file, ://, and then within my current directory I'm looking for a file named teams.json. Batch write item. Crusted resource not found. The reason it's not finding the resource, it has nothing to do with the file name. I was thinking it had to do with teams.json. I want this running on my local copy of DynamoDB, so I have to set the endpoint URL. Okay, once that's done, I should be able to do that for players. And then I should be able to do that for games. At that point, I should have a local instance of the database with data in the database. Okay, so I can clear the screen. I can issue the command DynamoDB scan. The table name that I want is baseball stats local. And then my endpoint URL is again going to be my local machine. And you can see I have data now. I have 23 records. That's kind of the record set that we've been working with the whole time. Okay, so the assumption is that we can get to this point now. So we can install the AWS CLI. We can install DynamoDB locally. We can start the database locally. And we can import our data locally. Okay, if we wanted to push our data out to our server, so our AWS instance, then we need to use an IAM account. We have to get those key credentials, the private key, public key. And then once we have the private key, public key, then we would issue the command AWS configure. It asks for the access key and the secret access key and the region name. And mine's already configured, so I didn't change anything. I kept the defaults. It's still using my account. Okay, and then I just went and set the endpoint URL on all of these commands. So if I have the right private key and public key, it will push this data out to my AWS instance. So if I want those same 23 records, I can go through the same process and issue that batch write item to push those files out to my AWS instance. Okay. Okay, so we know that we get charged based on our read capacity units and our write capacity units. That's how we get billed for DynamoDB. So if I run that same command again, but this time I want to get the read capacity that I use, so I'm going to return consumed capacity. So I'm adding an additional parameter, and the way I'm going to get that is a total. So I issued the same command, but now I issued an additional parameter saying, I want you to tell me how many read units this statement would take up, this scan. And what will happen is you'll see that my consumed capacity is half a read unit. That's how much it costed to read this. If you remember back when we were initially talking about DynamoDB, we were able to determine the read. So our data is replicated automatically across 3 regions. That's how DynamoDB works. And it takes approximately 15 minutes. So as I change data, it gets replicated across those 3 regions. The way DynamoDB works by default is you get an eventually consistent read. So if I insert a record and then I read it immediately, I may get the data from a different region than I wrote to. It may be there, it may not be there. It's eventually consistent. For the most part, that's good enough. But I do have the option of changing that. So if I issue that same command, so the same exact command, but this time I want to change it so that I'm doing a consistent read. So I just add that additional flag that I want to do a consistent read as opposed to an eventually consistent read. You'll notice that the read capacity units doubles in size. If I was doing this through a transaction, it would double in size again. So if I want a consistent read within a transaction, it's going to cost 4 times as much as just an eventually consistent read. Okay, so it gets expensive. Okay, so our scan, we're scanning all of the records. Why am I only getting charged for half a read capacity unit or 1 read capacity unit if there's 23 records? Can't hear. It's the size of the data, right? So I get 4K for 1 read capacity unit. I'm at half that. Okay, so eventually, as our data set grows and grows, we don't necessarily want to scan our entire table. Our entire table is our entire application. We want to filter it down so we only get the data that we care about. So for instance, I might only want information about a specific team, right? So Instead of using a scan, which scans all of the data, every time I do a scan, so the first command that we looked at was the scan, instead of doing a scan, I might want to do a query. So I'm going to do AWS DynamoDB query. And the way I want to handle this is I'm going to specify my table name as baseball stats local. Okay. And then I want to specify a key condition expression. The key condition expression is really your where clause. Okay, so I really want to be clear about what this is. With this key condition expression, so I say this key condition expression. I say it's like your SQL where clause. So I think most of us are comfortable saying, select star from teams where team equals, and then we specify a team, right? Like the LA Angels, something like that, right? So this key condition expression is really this where clause. That's our replacement for our where clause. The difference being is I'm never going to put the actual value in my key condition expression. Never. It's never going to happen. So instead of having the team equal to LAA, what ends up happening is we put a parameter there. And depending on the SQL language that you're using, you'll define parameters differently. So in SQL Server, you might have an @. In Oracle, I think you have a colon. In MySQL, you have a question mark. In Access, you have a question mark. But really what's going on there is you're defining a parameter. And the way DynamoDB works is we basically define a parameter with this colon is kind of the convention, and then we'd say :t. So we're basically saying that we're going to have a parameter called :t, that's the name of our parameter, that we're going to replace with an actual team name. Okay? So in our case, we want to say our key condition expression is the team ID is equal to some parameter. So I'm going back over here, and our key condition expression is going to be that our team ID, and I just want to point this out, depending on which version of the AWS CLI you're working with, sometimes this needs to be in quotes, sometimes it doesn't. So I know on my machine, I can get away with putting this in quotes. So the team ID is equal to :t. That's my key condition expression. So I'm basically saying that that's my where clause. But :t is just a parameter. I have to specify the actual team ID. And the way I do that is with the expression attribute values. Okay, so I'm going to have another parameter called expression attribute values, where I supply the value for t. Okay, and the way I'm going to define t is I'm going to say there's a parameter called t that's equal to some object. Okay, so the syntax gets a little bit messy here. We talked about JSON last week. So I have a JSON object, my parameter name is t, and then the value is another object where I define the type and the value. So the right-hand side of this colon is going to be another object. I have to specify the data type, so the team ID is a string, and the value is going to be team info underscore LAA. I know it's hard to read as it word wraps. So just to clarify for everyone what it is. So I have a JSON object defining my variable :t. And on the right-hand side of it is another object. And then I close the outer object. So I close the closing curly or the beginning curly braces. And then in here I define the type and the value. So the type is indicated by an S, indicating that it's a string. And then here is where I have my value of that parameter. Since it's a string, it's going to be quoted. That's the syntax that we're using. Parameter, colon, and then this object is the corresponding value. So the parameter is a string, and it has a certain value associated with it. Okay. And once we've done that, we should be able to issue this command. We want to do that on our local database instance. So our endpoint URL is going to be this localhost colon 8000. And this doesn't look good. Unknown options S, and then team info LAA. I think it has to do with my data. So I don't think it's team underscore info. I think it's just team info. Still doesn't like that command. I think it wants the whole thing in quotes, this expression attribute values. So I'm putting single quotes around the outside. And again, it's going to depend on your version of, it's going to depend on your version of the AWS CLI. So I have single quotes around it now, and now it's wanting me to escape all of the double quotes. I don't know that you necessarily need to do that, depending on which version of the AWS CLI you're working on. Expecting property name enclosed in double quotes. So it doesn't like that command. Unknown options. This is always fun because I did this on another machine earlier and it was working fine. And now as I'm switching different instances of the AWS CLI, I'm running into kind of the same issues. Expression attribute values, :T. Known options. Maybe I don't even need to escape it. Missed key schema element. That looks like a different issue. I think the query is working fine. I just screwed it up, so you can see that the schema is identifying team ID with an uppercase I and D, as opposed to an uppercase I and a lowercase d. So I just have a case sensitivity issue. So instead of saying team ID equals right here with the :T, I need to have the case matching. If I do that, I finally have it working. And I'll be honest with you, the syntax is really bothersome for me. So I'm working on my machine, and then on Windows it's a different syntax. Whether I put quotes around the expression attribute values or if I can just use JSON, it's really dependent on the version of AWS CLI that you're working with. So if you need help kind of figuring that out, by all means let me know. But we're able to scan. Okay, so I have one record with that team. Okay, so then what if I want players on a specific team? Okay, or I want different data. Right, so if I want player data for a specific team, you can see like the person that wrote that DynamoDB course is a Los Angeles Angels fan. So he's got the Yankees, the Angels, and then he's got some West Coast teams like the Padres and Oakland. But the Angels have multiple players. Okay, so if I want to write a different query, my condition expression is still the same, so it's still the team ID, but my expression attribute value is not teaminfo underscore LAA, it's going to be playerinfo underscore LAA. Okay, and what that does, so if I head back over, so instead of teaminfo, I'm using playerinfo. Now you'll notice that I scanned 4 records as opposed to 23 records. So there's 4 Angels players. Everyone's good with that? So my scanned count was 4 as opposed to 23. So what ends up happening is because I have that key condition expression and the key attribute values, it can resolve the fact that there's only certain records that map to that hash. So instead of scanning all the records, I don't have to look through the entire database. This is what DynamoDB does. So if I scan, it looks through every record and compares them. But if I query, I'm saying, here's the key that I'm looking for, and DynamoDB places all those same records with that same key in a certain location, so it grabs all of the data from that location. And it only looked at those 4 records. So it only billed me for reading 4 records. Right? That's how DynamoDB works, is it hashes that key and puts those data elements in a specific spot, a specific location, so that I can store them quickly and retrieve them quickly. So it's not looking at every record. So I say, yeah, I only want the players that belong to this team. DynamoDB doesn't have to look at every record. It knows exactly where those records are. Right? So if you give me a bunch of data, I have to look through everything and say, oh, is this person from the Angels or not? That's not how DynamoDB works. They stored it in a certain order so that they can pull it out in a certain order. And that's what happened here. So queries are much more efficient than scans. Right? Okay, so if I want to look at games, so I want to look at game info where, so right now I have player info from the Los Angeles Angels. I'm going to do game info for the Angels. Did I have a typo? Games, sorry, not game info. Okay, so there's 6 games that come back from that query that involve the Angels. And then it might be nice to say, I want all of the games that the Angels played, and if we look at this data, it looks like it's from this past year, right? So they played April 15th, 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th. Like those are the 6 records, so the 14th through the 20th, or the 15th through the 20th, I can't remember. Yeah, the 15th through the 20th. Maybe I only want games within a certain range. So I want the Angels games from April 15th to April 17th. Okay? The sort key is here, and that's going to tell us when they were actually played. Okay. So I have the opening query, which is to say I want all of the Angels games. So it's going to take 6 records, right? There's 6 games that the Angels played. I want to filter it down to just a specific date range. So at the 15th, 16th, 17th, I just want 3 games because they only played 1 game a day. So in order for that to happen, I have to have a filter expression. Okay, and the way the filter expression works is I'm going to add an additional attribute. I always like the endpoint URL as the last parameter, but I'm going to have a filter expression. And the filter expression is just like another where clause, but my where clause can only be on the primary key. So my where clause, since I'm using DynamoDB, has to be on that team ID. A filter expression can be on anything, any piece of data within any of my records. Okay, so I can filter my data set down. Okay, so the way the filter expression works is it works exactly the same way as my where clause. So my key condition expression is only for your primary key. And I'm using the wrong terminology. It's for your hash key. That's the key condition expression. The filter expression is for any data. Okay, here's the problem with the filter expression though. And I think it's important that you know this because this is how you get billed. So you can really think about it before we start writing applications against DynamoDB. The key condition expression is for my hash key, and we already know that the way DynamoDB stores our data is I have a hash key and then it locates our data in a specific spot based on our hash key. Like that's how it locates it quickly. So if I say the only records that I want are the Angels records, it goes and grabs those Angel records. It doesn't look at all the data. It just grabs the specific data that I'm asking for because I specified the hash key that I'm looking for. So it knows exactly which records I'm talking about. It doesn't have to filter or it doesn't have to scan everything. So it grabs these specific records that I'm asking for. With the filter expression, it's any key attribute. So here's the way this works is if I have a filter expression, whether I'm scanning or querying, I am going to read all of the data that matches the scan or the query. Okay, so if I want to query the games that the Angels were involved in, I'm going to read 6 records because that's going to find 6 records that the 6 games where the Angels were involved. It's going to cost me 6 read units if each record was a read unit. So I have to look at all 6 of those records. So I initially grab all 6 of the records and then I filter it down from there. So I'm still paying the read costs, but now after the fact, after I've read the data, all the matching records based on my hash key, now I'm filtering it down to say I only want games within a specific date range. Whether that's a scan or a query, it doesn't matter. So there's really only 2 types of data selection. There's a query and there's a scan. Query, you can specify exactly what data you want based on the hash key, so I can really limit how much I'm reading. A scan, I'm reading all of the data. After that, I can filter the data down based on my criteria, but I've already paid for the reads that happened. Okay? Does that make sense? Sort of. So scan or query, that's the only way I can determine my bill. That's how I can change my cost. Scan, I'm going to pay for a read of every record of the database table. And a query, I'm only going to pay for the records that I'm querying against. And I can really limit that to say I only care about these records based on the hash key. So scan or query. That's how my bill is determined. Then I might not want all of that data, so I can filter it down, but that doesn't affect the cost. Okay, so now I'm going back over to the terminal. I want to filter this down. So my filter expression works just like my key condition expression, except it doesn't have any impact on my cost. So my filter expression, what I want to do is I want to say I want to I want to say it's actually the sort key, so I think it has to go into my key condition expression. Let me use a attribute that doesn't matter. It's not part of my sort key. So I was thinking the date was not part of the sort key, but it is. So I'm going to use runs. I only want the games where there were more than 5 runs. Okay, so I want to filter it down so that my filter expression is runs greater than or equal to a parameter named r. Okay, so if we're reading that expression right now, we have a couple of things. If I run this right now, it's going to fail because it doesn't know what r is. I have a parameter named r and it doesn't know what the value is. So if I try to run this right now, it fails. So it tells me there's an invalid filter expression. It tells me there's a value in the expression that's not defined, attribute value r. So if I clear this and bring it back up, my filter expression and my key condition expression both have a parameter. So the key condition expression has a parameter t, my filter expression has a parameter r. All of my parameter values get defined in my expression attribute values. So it doesn't matter whether it's a key condition expression or a filter expression, the attribute values define all of my parameters. So right now I have one parameter t, it's a string, and it's games underscore LAA, but I need another parameter here. So instead of games underscore LAA being the only parameter, I want to have another parameter. That other parameter is going to be :r, and it's going to have a value. And runs, I think, is a number, is how it's defined. So I'm going to define it as a number, n, and the value is going to be 5. So now I have 2 expression attribute values. The first one is :t, which says it's a string, and the string should be games underscore LAA. And then I have a second one, which is :r. It's a number, and the value is just 5. Okay, and if I run this now, validation failed, invalid type for parameter, value 5. I think number is fine. Maybe it's defined as a string. That's not right. It should be a number, and I should be able to use n. And the reason it's failing, the reason I'm not getting any records back, is because it's trying to do a type comparison. I'm confident in my DynamoDB types. All numbers. I wonder if I still have to quote it as a number. So I'm specifying that it's a number, and even though it's a number, and I wouldn't normally put quotes around it, that's what's going on. So I have 6 scanned records, but I only have 4 returned results. So I scanned all the records where the game info or the game was tied to the Angels. So it cost me 6 read units, or 6 reads. I had to read 6 records to find games involving the Angels. But then I lost 2 records because I said I only care when the runs is greater than or equal to 5. Okay, so if I change this, right, and do the opposite, so I say less than 5, I should pick up those 2 other records. So runs is less than 5. I should see those 2 additional games. So it said it cost me 6 reads. I had to look at all the games where the Angels were involved, but it only picked up the 2 games where the runs were less than 5. Because those things are not part of the key, it's costing me 6 read units. Filter does not matter, right, in terms of how you're getting billed. It gets me the correct data set that I want. The only thing that's going to affect my bill is if I query by the keys. So the keys being either the team ID or the sort key. So then my follow-up question for you is, if I want, so my initial statement was I wanted games that were a specific date range. So Angels within a specific date range. All right, and the date range is the string that's part of the key. It's the sort key. Does that affect my bill? If it's part of the key, it affects your bill. So if I were to say I only want Angels games from this 3-day sample, then I'm only going to read 3 records. Okay, so right now I'm reading all 6 to get specific records. Okay, but if I did that with a key, so if I want a specific date range, then it's going to take my bill down because I don't have to read those records if it's part of the key. We can do that. And again, I'll post this on Blackboard, so you don't have to remember these commands. Like to some extent, I want you to remember the commands because they're going to be important. So we care about the key condition expression. That's our where clause. That's how we write SQL. We care about the expression attribute values. That's how we define the values of our parameters. We care about the filter expression. That's kind of like another where clause after the fact. Okay, so we care about those 3 things, but the syntax of it I don't necessarily care about, right? Okay, so don't worry too much about the syntax, but I want to write another expression, so I'm not going to use a filter expression. I don't care about the runs, right? So I'm going to get rid of that key and the attribute expression value. But within my key condition expression, now I want to filter it down even more. So I want to say and the sort key is between 2 dates. Right? So date 1, so start, or D1, and D2. So I'm going to give it 2 different dates. So I have 2 parameters, D1 and D2, start date and end date, essentially. Okay, so then my expression attribute values have to reflect that. So I'm going to have a value for :D1. It's a string. And the first date that we care about is 2019-04-15. That has to be quoted. So that's my parameter for D1. And then I need another parameter for D2, which is the end date. And it's going to be a string, and it's going to have a value of 2019-04-17. So I'm saying I want the team ID, which is going to be the Angels, and I want their games between D1, which is 4/15, so April 15th, and D2, which is April 17th. I'm only looking at 3 games now. And because that's part of the primary key, that those dates, the sort key is the date, what's going to happen is error parsing parameter, invalid JSON.
That D1 ending quote on the date.
Thank you. I didn't get a quote, I got a colon, huh? D1 colon, and then D2 colon, let me clear this. Values, and I'm closing the single quotes, I'm closing the outer curly braces, so really I just am affected right here, D1. So I have this object, which is a string, and I don't need curly braces around the expression. So D1 is a string. It's an object that is a string that has a value. Same thing over here. It's an object that's a string that has a value. And you'll notice that I only get 3 records. So I asked for the Angels games between these dates. So the 15th and the 18th, or I'm sorry, the 17th. I have 3 records that match. I only had to look at 3 records. Even though the Angels played in 6 games, I don't have to scan all 6 records to find those 3 games. If I did that same thing, except I didn't put the sort key in the key condition expression, instead I put it in a filter expression. So over here I have a filter expression equal to sk between D1 and D2. That's my filter expression. So I still am looking for those same parameters. I just moved it from the key condition expression to the filter expression. I get the same exact result set. Oh, I used to be able to do this. I used to get the exact same result set, but I got billed for all the Angels games. So I'd get billed for 6 records. And now it looks like they've kind of taken care of that, so you're not inadvertently getting billed extra for something that shouldn't be billed extra. So I can't filter on one of my keys. Okay. I get it. This is way more involved than coming out to AWS if I sign into the console. Right? And I go into DynamoDB and I have baseball stats sitting here and I can look at the items. Right? And then I can come through and I could say, I want to start a search or add a filter or a query. Right? So this is way easier to use graphically, right? So if I want to say, I want to query baseball stats where the team info is _ LAA and start the search. I don't want to filter. I get 1 record. If I want games that involve the Angels, I can do that. It's really easy, right? It's fairly intuitive now that we've looked at this from a terminal or command line interface. You're like, yeah, this makes a ton of sense. That's great. I want you to be able to use the graphical tools. I'm not going to suggest like, hey, we're not using graphical tools in this class. That's ridiculous. You should use the graphical tools to manage your database instances. The reason I spent so much time with you in the terminal and working from the terminal is because when we write code against DynamoDB, this is what we're going to use. We're going to use the the key condition expression. We're going to use the filter condition expression, and then we're going to set the attribute values. And then we can run our code. So all of this is designed not so that we can administer the database, but so that we can write code against that data. So if I want to insert a record, if I want to retrieve records, so if I want to write code against that data set, I'm going to have to deal with these parameters. There's only 3, and I get it. The syntax is kind of overwhelming. So we're kind of learning JSON on the fly, and even the JSON gets a little bit messy. So I get it that the syntax gets a little bit overwhelming, but there's really only 3 parameters that we need to know. What's the key condition expression? What's the filter expression? And then what are those attribute values for those expressions? That's really it. So it seems kind of overwhelming, but then when you get into the graphical interface, it's like, oh, now it's not overwhelming. Right? And I'm okay with you getting a little overwhelmed up front so that we can code it, and it looks easier after the fact. Okay? So on Thursday, what we're going to do is kind of a quick Node.js introduction. So we'll install Node.js, we're going to install npm, and then we're going to look at how do I use the AWS tools to actually get data out of a database from code. Okay, and that's where the key condition expression, the filter expression, and those key condition or key attribute values are going to come into play. We're going to write code that does that. So it's just JavaScript code. And I just taught the intro to JavaScript class, so there will be some kind of on-the-fly JavaScript stuff that you're going to pick up, but it won't be bad. Okay? And that's kind of where we're going to work this semester. So when we're dealing with the AWS SDK, we're going to be working in Node.js. So we'll get it installed. We'll talk about how do we configure a project, how do we run those projects, and that's what we'll do on Thursday. Okay? And then the whole goal of that is that we'll then be able to access this data. We'll be able to insert records, we'll be able to delete records, we'll be able to select records from Node.js and get that data into our JavaScript application. Okay? So I'm going to stop here for today. Again, your lab is using this graphical interface. So the one trick to the graphical interface is I have to get the data loaded. So really for the lab, actually the lab you're not working with this data, are you? You're working with a different data set. I'm having you create items on the fly. So shouldn't be difficult at all is my expectation. The lab I assigned, so the DynamoDB lab, I think it's lab 4. I assigned last Thursday. It'll be due on Thursday of this week. Okay, so you're creating a table, you're inserting some data, you're editing some data, and you're deleting some data. That's all that's really going on with the lab, but you're using the graphical tool for all of that. Okay, so I will post